It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is David deSilva, and we're going to be discussing his new book, A Week in the Life of Ephesus. David, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Shaun. It's great to be here with you.
Well, let's kick off our conversation with a bit of what we might call the David deSilva origin story. This is the first time we're meeting. I know you're going to be new to many of my viewers, many of my listeners. So let's start with that. What are some of the things they need to know about you?
Well, I'm a lifelong Christian. I don't have a great conversion story because I don't really have a BC period. I was brought up by church-going parents in the Episcopal Church of the United States, and I fell in love with God through the beauty of the liturgy and the hymnody and the scriptures from a very early age. And I've done what I've done ever since because of two things. The way God gripped me through music. And so on the side, I've been a church musician since I was 18. And the way God gripped me through the scriptures. A turning point in my life, I read the Gospel of Matthew in its entirety when I was 11 years old. And I couldn't get enough of scripture ever since. So that sent my trajectory into becoming a professor of the New Testament, ultimately, to help those going into Christian ministry to really hear the word so they could proclaim the word faithfully. And that's about it. I'm sure you've had much more interesting origin stories on your show.
The good thing is I didn't enter into this thinking you had some epic story of meeting Jesus or this massive transformation. I had a guest not too long ago where I was like, yeah, tell me about your conversion story. He's like, what conversion story? I was raised in church. It's like, oh man, I thought there was something more there. So I didn't pull on that thread anymore. In terms of academic background, specialization, I'm curious, where did you focus a lot of your studies as you were kind of coming up in the academic world? And then in terms of teaching, where has your focus been?
Okay. My doctoral work focused on the letter to the Hebrews, and I was very interested in the cultural world of the first century and the way an author would use cultural topics to advance a pastoral strategy, a rhetorical strategy. So I brought honor and shame language, grace and patronage language together with rhetorical studies to kind of figure out how the sermon that we call the letter to the Hebrews sought to persuade and achieved its goals to solidify commitment in a rather harassed Christian community. And as happens, your dissertation work kind of becomes your aura for the first 5 to 7 years of your academic life. So I did a lot of work in Hebrews, but along the way, I also did a lot of work in Second Temple Judaism. So I've established myself, I think I could say this without arrogance, as a scholar of the Apocrypha and other Second Temple Jewish literature. And continuing along the path, I dug into Revelation quite fully. I've written 2 books on that, and I'm working on, actually, I've just finished a third. It was just accepted formally. That's always a good email to get from an editor. Working toward a commentary in maybe 2023. And I've worked with Paul, because if you don't work with Paul, you haven't really dealt with the New Testament yet. That's how most folks think. So I had to get out of the back 40 of the New Testament canon, the Hebrews to Revelation. And so I worked on Galatians for a number of years, producing a commentary on that in 2018.
Thanks for giving us some context for your background, who you are. Next, let's get into the book. Would love to hear a little bit about, say, the story behind the book. I think yours is this the 7th or 8th contribution to the Week in the Life series? So it had been out for some time, so to speak, before you got involved. So what was your interest or curiosity to contribute to the work that's in progress with this series?
Well, thank you. Technically, it's the 7th, which is appropriate for a book that tries to give context to Revelation. I'm told by IVP that it might be the last, but who knows? If it sells well, we might have a week in the life of all kinds of places. A week in the life of Laodicea or something. And I spent a number of weeks, that's a little bit too much. I spent a number of half weeks in Ephesus over a number of years, and Pergamum and other cities addressed by Revelation. And the more I immersed myself in the real context of what it was to live in those cities, the more Revelation opened up in new ways. And so writing for this series seemed like a really ideal way to try to bring to life a little slice, or actually a few slices of life in Ephesus that might help readers think about Revelation as it impacted its first century hearers. And who knows, if all goes well, it might change the way people apply Revelation today. And so, not to anticipate other questions you might have, but my main goal in writing this is to suggest to people, if we immerse ourselves enough in the late first century cities of Asia Minor that receive this book, we're not going to be confused by thinking about a beast or a whore or what this message might be. And we're not going to say, oh, wow, we haven't seen any of this yet. We have that impression because we haven't looked in Ephesus closely enough. So that was the story behind the story.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's so beautiful with so many of the books that we've seen really in the last 10 to 15 years of scholars taking things that were kind of for the academy or the ivory tower and bringing them down to a level that anybody can access it, making it attainable for the person in the pew, if you will. And that's what I think is one of the things that is beautiful about the Week in the Life series in terms of it's a story, you've got pictures, you've got call-outs and explanations that give you it's like a sidebar context for what you're learning as you're going through it. And I just find that's extremely helpful because one of the things I've realized just meeting people in church and doing life with other Christians is even the benefit of going to a 4-year Bible college is a privilege that a lot of people didn't have. And when you meet people who just didn't grow up in the church and weren't able to be immersed in some intense Bible study at a higher academic level, they've missed out on a lot. And so there are so many wonderful things that people can connect with when they connect into series like the A Week in the Life series. One of the things I'm always curious when somebody sort of transitions or hops kind of types of writing temporarily to do a project, I'm always curious, was it challenging? Like what differed for you in terms of writing fiction versus nonfiction? Because it is a completely different skill set. So we'd love to hear about that part of this journey.
You're absolutely right that it's different. But I was an English major, and this is not my first rodeo in historical fiction. So I worked out a lot of those issues of genre and what's appropriate to create historical fiction when I wrote Day of Atonement, which was a novel about the Maccabean Revolt, about the decade leading up to the Maccabean Revolt. How to bring characters to life, how to use dialogue to develop plot and issues rather than load people up with narration, which is how we present issues in academic writing. How to think about scenery, how to develop, how to immerse people in a set that they cannot see. So I got to work through a lot of that, and that took a lot more time because that was about 3 times the length of this. So it was rather easy then to think about Ephesus and this book. A lot of the time I took kind of in the background was thinking about the layout of the city itself, thinking about the movement of characters, what they would see as they walked, what I wanted to foreground in that. I think I forget to take people to the latrine at any point in this book, and that's actually a real trip to make in the ancient world. And then what are these spaces like? Because they're ruins now. So what would they have looked like in their heyday? And I've had the benefit of traveling to a lot of places in the ancient world, in the Mediterranean before, this stupid pandemic hit. So I am stateside for the whole year. So Pompeii, for example, really helps to think about what the houses of the elite and the places, the common spaces looked like before they fell into ruins. So if you want to know more, ask more.
We will get there. Well, and if people want to dive into what ancient latrines were like, Holly actually covers quite a bit about latrines and bathhouses in A Week in the Life of a Greco-Roman Woman. So if you're curious, that would be a great place to go. She has some very specific scenes that she plays out there. So it will satiate all curiosity you probably have about ancient latrine use. So there you go.
Although the image of diving into latrines is probably not the one we want to go with.
No, we're going to lay that one to rest, and we'll be good. I'd like to pull a little bit more on the thread of Ephesus. So for people who just don't have a lot of context for Ephesus, would love to hear a little bit about, in terms of understanding the biblical world, why is it important? And then follow that up with, in terms of the time period you've set the story in, 80, 89, what's significant about that?
Ephesus is, of course, really important for the New Testament story because Paul spent at least 3 years there. And he kept going back there. And people from there kept meeting with him. And if we look at the later Pauline letters, Paul continues to have impact on Ephesus through his delegate Timothy. And then, of course, Ephesus emerges at the end of the canon as one of the, in fact, maybe the chief of the 7 cities, just in terms of its political and economic standing among the 7, addressed by Revelation. Ephesus continues to be immensely important for the Christian story. Ignatius, the martyr from Antioch, the bishop martyr from Antioch, writes a letter to Ephesus in about 110. Ephesus is the site of major church councils during the formative centuries of our theology. So why is Ephesus important? There it is. It is a gold star landmark on the landscape of early Christianity. And if you were to kind of live there, you would be immersed in the ways in which religion and politics and civics and economics are all wedded, and social life are all wedded inseparably. For the 21st century Christian, we have this kind of idea of the separation of church and state. For the first century anyone, there was no such conception. So when you went to the meeting of a trade guild, when you went to a meeting of the civic assembly, when you walked through the civic forum, you were greeted with sights of religion. The civic forum, in the center of the civic forum, is a temple to Augustus and Rome. Overlooking the civic forum is the temple of Domitian that is being inaugurated in a couple of weeks after this week in the life of Ephesus. So it's an immersion into into a world where religion is vitally important for every aspect of society, as opposed to an optional add-on for those who are inclined, as it is in 21st century society. For Revelation in particular, it's important to see the world because I would say the prominent scholarly approach to Revelation is this. It's to look at Revelation not as a text that needs to be interpreted by the reader, but as a text that interprets the world of the reader. And Revelation very particularly interprets the worlds of Ephesus and Pergamum very directly, making those first century hearers look out at these religious monuments and all the activity that happens around them, and to look down to the economic bustle of the harbor and all the ships heading westward to Rome with their wares very differently. So I hope that starts to answer your good question.
And then in terms of time frame, what's significant about setting it in 80, 89?
Scholars date Revelation anywhere from about 68 AD to the time that I'm positing. Is it written in the wake of Nero's suicide? Is it written in the wake of the rebuilding of empire after Vespasian? So I opt for the latter. And this particular week is important because the city of Ephesus finally gets provincial recognition. It's awarded the right to build a temple to the Flavian emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And this allows Ephesus to one-up itself on its rival cities, Smyrna and Pergamum, that had enjoyed this honor for half a century in Smyrna for a temple to Tiberius and a full century in Pergamum for a temple to Augustus. So civic pride, civic identity are all crystallizing around the inauguration of the Temple of Domitian in late 89 or early 90 AD. Their years kind of run differently from ours. Their New Year's Day is September 23rd in Asia Minor, because 100 years before Revelation is written, they decide that Augustus's birthday was so important for the well-being of the world that because it started a new era, Augustus's birthday deserved to be New Year's Day. And that already tells us a lot about what it must mean to be a Christian in Ephesus or any other city in that province, proclaiming a very different Savior whose birth was good news for the world.
David, next I'd love for you to introduce us to a few of the key characters that we're going to meet in the book, and also tell us maybe kind of what's their conflict or challenge that they're facing. Give us kind of maybe how they're the web of how they're enmeshed and connected.
Sure. If there's a main character, I would say it's a rather up-and-coming elite man named Amyntas. And Amyntas is a Christian, but Amyntas also wants to be, part of the civic life of the community. And his challenge is going to be, how far can he be a player in Ephesus while remaining a worshiper of one and only one God and his anointed and his Christ. So there is also Serapion, who is another elite who really a pious man. And he detests the atheists in the city, those who disbelieve in the gods in favor of their one God. So he's got nothing good to say about Jews or this newer sect, Christians, because he believes them to be detracting from the gods what is the gods do, and thus jeopardizing civic well-being. So he puts the screws to Amyntas publicly by nominating him to be a priest, a junior priest of the new Temple of Domitian when an opening arises, forcing Amyntas to make a decision. Is he going to witness to one God, or is he going to learn to accommodate? So we also meet Nicholas. Nicholas, perhaps you've heard of his band, the Nicolaitans, who comes to Ephesus from Pergamum. And he is a Christian who has decided that the way to advance the Christian cause is also to accommodate fully. He is a junior priest of the Temple of Augustus in Pergamum. And he will try to show Amyntas that there is a way to have the best of both worlds. In another part of town, there's a merchant named Demetrius. And he takes us to the commercial forum and to the merchant life and to the harbor life of the city. And he's a Christian also. And he's trying to wrestle with the economic disparities that Roman imperialism has brought to Ephesus. Now, he's been profiting from it, but he's also beginning to see some of the problems with that and wondering how he can be true to the ethics, the morality of the Hebrew scriptures and the teachings of Jesus while making his way as a merchant. So he and his family are embroiled in that set of debates. We meet a vocal Christian named Deodatus who throws caution to the wind and denounces slavery in the commercial forum, denounces the wedding of idolatry and commerce in the forum, and gets beaten up for it just outside the forum. And we meet Flavius Zeuxis, a rich Jewish merchant who is also trying to navigate how to be part of the Roman economic system as a shipmaster, a ship owner, and a seafaring merchant, with the justice of it all. So they're finding their way through those difficult waters. And I won't tell you how it all turns out.
You got to read the book to get the conclusion. That's all there is to it. David, in terms of the writing journey, were any of the characters maybe particularly challenging to bring to life? Or if they weren't challenging, did any of them kind of take on a life of their own that you weren't expecting, which often happens when you're writing fiction?
That's a great question. Well, okay. So before I started writing, just being the type A person that I am, I really mapped all of the characters' journeys out. So I don't know that there were a lot of surprises. But as I wrote, I did find some tweaks. For example, a slave in Serapion's house is able to show civil disobedience in the household by not participating in any of the idolatrous rituals, because he's been converted to the Christian faith. But of course, he has no authority over his body. So he is at risk of being beaten and disciplined because he embarrasses Serapion, a priest of Artemis, by not showing up at public festivals. But this also gives him an opportunity to witness to his mistress, not in the common sense, but the domina of the household, and make her begin to wonder, is there more to Christianity than there is to the religion that she has pursued all of her life? It was difficult to figure out how to make the Ephesian Christian church as a whole match the criticisms that John levels of the church in Revelation 2. But let's just say I was able to figure out how to do that in terms of its having forsaken the love that it had at first. And that shows up particularly among the more conservative, rigid personages of the house churches, in Amyntas's house and Demetrius's house, and how they have to navigate strong boundaries while still being fully invitational and even compassionate toward those who are hostile toward them.
And I guess a little bit more about story context in the book. In terms of maybe scenes that we're going to experience or encounter in the book, is there anything that you think will particularly surprise readers? Or I always like to ask these two-part questions because it's how I'm made. Or is there maybe a scene that you were able to create that you were just most proud of, that you brought something to life that you just think is really cool? I mean, pick a direction and go.
Those are both great directions. So I'm particularly proud of the way I brought pagan cult scenes to life. Because, there's not a lot to go on in the New Testament or other ancient literature to do that. But and who knows, these might be the scenes that tax readers the most. But I was really proud of the procession of the goddess Artemis to the temple of Augustus. So one god sends another god greetings on his birthday. And what all goes into the pageantry and celebration, and how does that bring a whole city together? And so what does it mean to be conspicuously absent from such a scene? I like the way I brought the Temple of Domitian to life and explored some of the special effects that could be used in the ancient world to make religious experiences a bit more impactful for the worshipers. I mean, fortunately, we don't use special effects, in Christian worship anymore to try to, I'm sorry, no, I'm just a little bashed.
Fog machine.
Mist machine, exactly right. But, they had some tricks in the ancient world to do that too. Um, and while I'm at it, I really enjoyed putting together a scene um, where visiting dignitaries from Smyrna and Pergamum had dinner with local dignitaries. And this was the first opportunity that Nicholas had to witness to Christianity. Nicholas, the compromised Christian, but still finds ways to talk about um, uh, the distinctive offerings of the Christian faith, although in such a way that doesn't offer any challenge to the status quo. In fact, merely says Christianity can support the status quo just fine, which of course is not where we want readers to go after this book.
Next question. So obviously you got to spend time in Ephesus learning and kind of immersing yourself in the city as much as you could. Then you create this story that is set in Ephesus. As you were making this fictional account, I'm curious, what were the new and surprising things you saw? Because it's one thing to visit and see. It's another thing to like really imagine people just going about life in the world. And so what did you discover that you hadn't seen before until you were creating this story?
You're right that it makes a difference, because the attention to detail in writing a book demands going back and looking at photos much more closely, for real life decorations, for example, or house layouts, and so I found myself spending a lot of time with archaeologists, not really maps, but kind of reconstructions of the layouts of places, things that you could never, at least I could never, walk away from a site and have in my mind. And then, of course, how do people just do things in the ancient world? How do they get dressed? What do they eat at different levels of society? What does a meal look like in the modestly well-to-do merchant house, modestly, versus the place where the city fathers hold their state dinner and what have you? How does commerce happen in a place? What does a shop look like? What does the slave market look like? What does Zeuxis see as he walks from his ship in the harbor up the main street toward the theater? I mean, what kind of cargoes and goods, and how is a building constructed? Because the great harbor gymnasium is under construction at this time. So how does that happen? How do we transport huge granite pillars? So all these little details kind of force themselves upon me to go to these stacks of books, many of which I bought only for the project, to look at what archaeologists and historians have been able to uncover about the nitty gritty of doing things in the ancient world.
In terms of the big journey of the reader with this book, if they take away one idea or you've somehow shifted them in one specific way, what's that big thing you want every single reader to take from the pages of the book?
Now, that is a question I wish I had in advance. Wow, that's a great question. Wow.
Save the best for last.
All right. So the biggest idea is this. Revelation doesn't challenge us to think about what's going to happen in the 7 last years. Revelation challenges us, just like it challenges Amyntas and Demetrius, to think about how they're going to live out a distinctive Christian witness in the midst of a society that is built on values and practices quite opposed to those of the Hebrew prophets and Jesus. And that is really a place where our attention, like the attention of these characters, needs to go. If, when Christ does appear, we're going to be ready.
And David, for the listeners, the viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the book, where are some of the places we can find you on the web?
I teach at Ashland Theological Seminary. So I do have a kind of institutional page there. I also maintain my own personal web page and a blog that is very rarely contributed to by me. I'm the world's worst blogger. But these would be probably the primary venues.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with David and pick up your own copy of the book as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with David deSilva. Once again, our book today was A Week in the Life of Ephesus. And again, if you'd like to find out more about David, you can head on over to shauntabatt.com. I'll have this linked up for you there in the show notes again, places to buy the book, places to connect with David. And David, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's truly been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
It was a pleasure for me as well, Shaun. Thank you.